Uh, Alrighty. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this, our last and final installation of Shmuel Bet, which means we've now gone through Yehoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, and God willing, in just about a week from now, we will commence Malachim Aleph. So we've made quite strides in making our way through Tanakh. But tonight we're going to be able to conclude Shmuel Bet. So if you've looked at the chapters that we've, assigned for this evening, it's chapters 19 through 24. And they're kind of lengthy. It's 6 chapters. They're a bit, parts of it are a bit more engaging. Some are more lists. One of the prakim is an entire song, which actually parallels one of the Tehillim. So we can't really cover all of that tonight. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to cover 2 of the major stories, which end up being probably the most significant pieces of these 6 chapters. And then I'll just kind of briefly, very, very briefly, just like in 60 seconds, give us the overview of the parts that we're not going to cover tonight. But what we will cover tonight are 2 major stories. The first story is the end of chapter 19 into chapter 20. Which is the rebellion of Sheva ben Bechri, which is a famous story in Tanakh. We're going to focus on that story first. And then we're going to jump to the final chapter, which is going to be the story when David is asked to choose his punishment during the census. So that's the final story that we'll touch upon this evening. Okay, so let's dig in. I'm going to share with you my screen. The sources have already been sent out, but I will pull up the sources as well.
28 people today.
Alrighty. Okay, great. Okay, so chapter 19, the first 39 verses of chapter 19 are really the conclusion of what already took place in chapter 18. So just very briefly outside, so what's taken place is that Avshalom, right, one of David's sons, launched a rebellion against David. David has to squash it. His son, Avshalom, is killed. David is upset nevertheless. And now David is finally ready to return to Jerusalem after being in exile to kind of retake over his throne. So that's where the story is picking up. And we're going to pick up at the end of chapter 19 when David is, on his way back to Yerushalayim. So here it goes. Chapter 19, verse 40. So Vaya'avor chol ha'am et hayarden, right? Everyone's going back over the Jordan River. They've been fighting in Transjordan. They're going back over. V'hamelech avar vayishak hamelech leBarzilai vayavarchayu vayashav limkomo. So what happens? David says goodbye to Barzilai. Barzilai was a companion, a friend of David who helped him in battle. And he said to Barzilai, come back with me to Jerusalem. Barzilai says, I'm too old. I want to stay back, but you can take my son. And his son actually goes with David. His son is in the next verse 41. Vayavor hamelech haGilgal. He goes back to Gilgal, which is near Jericho. V'chimhan, the son of Barzilai, avarimo, goes with him. V'chol am Yehuda he'eviru el hamelech v'gam chatzi am Yisrael. So it sounds like at least half the nation, including the tribe of Judah, are going back, escorting the king back to Jerusalem. It's going to be important who is escorting the King David and who is not escorting King David. That's going to be very key. The verse continues, V'hinei, chol ish Yisrael ba'im el hamelech, va'yomu el hamelech. So everyone comes to the king and says, Madua genavucha achenu ish Yehuda. Why have our brethren, the men of Judah, why has the tribe of Judah kind of stolen the king away? That is to say, why is it that you have the king in the center, the tribe of Judah are like his bodyguards, and then everyone else is like off to the sides? Like, why is Judah getting preferential treatment when it comes to the king of Judah, of Yehuda, of Israel, right? We might say, well, why wouldn't they get preferential treatment, right? Where's King David from? The tribe of Judah. So why not give them preferential treatment? But we have seen this time and time again. If you want to be a good leader, you cannot show favor to certain peoples over others. And remember, early on in David's career, what made David a great leader was that he did not show favor, right? He made sure that all of the spoils went out to all of the tribes. He did not show favor. But what happens in this story, and what becomes the sin of this story, is David does show favor. So David is going back to Jerusalem, and we're going to see what he does. So all the men of Judah turn to the rest of the tribes of Israel and say the following, you know what? The king is close to us. Literally, both, he's close to us in friendship, but also we're part of the closest mishpacha. Why are you upset? Right? He's our family. Right? This is, the king decides who gets to be with him. The king wants to be close to us. We're his family. So kind of let it be. Vayan ish Yisrael et ish Yehuda. So everyone else, it sounds like all other tribes seem to turn back towards Judah. Vayomer eser yadot liva melech. How many hands, how many fingers does the king have that he has to look over? Meaning if the king is the body, he has 10 fingers. How many tribes of Israel are there? There's 12. But they're saying there are 10 against one. Judah is going to be one finger. He's going to be the 11th finger. The 10 others going to be referencing the 10 northern tribes. What tribe are we therefore missing? Anybody want to take a stab at it? If we have 10 tribes against Judah, Judah's one of them. What do we think the other tribe is? Binyamin, exactly. So Binyamin often is kind of like subsumed in the tribe of Judah, right? They're very small number. They're very close with Judah. But what we'll see shortly is that on the one hand, Benjamin is with Judah, but as the chapter will then show us, there's a faction within Benjamin that is against King David, and we'll see that in a moment. So Eser Yadot Liva Melech v'gam beDavid ani mimcha, right? There are 10 parts in the king. It's equal. Why does Judah get any extra care? The king should show favor to everyone. Madua hakilotani. Why has he kind of despised us? The king should show favor equally to all. And how does the pasuk end? Vayikesh devar ish Yehuda midvar ish Yisrael. The words of the men of Judah were fiercer. Vayikesh were fiercer, were harsher than the words of Israel. So what does that mean? So there's two approaches to what this pasuk means. Either the children of Judah were nastier, right? They had a fiercer approach. They would debate until the very end, so much so that it annoyed the rest of the tribe. So they're throwing words at them. The second approach, however, is to say Vayikesh Dvar Ish Yehuda in the eyes of David. That is to say, David saw the situation. He saw that he's causing unrest amongst the people, and nevertheless, he sided with Judah. Right, so you can see, again, one more story where the leadership of King David is being challenged and where he essentially is failing to bring the people together. And this leads us to the next story, which is the beginning of chapter 20, which is the story of Sheva ben Bichri. So let's open that story. And this is one of the major stories, one of the major rebellions against King David. V'sham nikra ish Blial. There's this nasty man, Blial, meaning this nobody, but at the same time, somebody who clearly the Tanakh finds despicable. What's his name? Sheva ben Bichri ish Yemini. So he's part of the Benjamin tribe, which mostly was aligned with Judah, but clearly not everyone. Vayitaka b'shofar. So we've been talking about the shofar every morning. So he blasts the shofar to gather up the tribe of Benjamin to fight David. Vayomer ein lanu chelek b'David. David's out of here. We have nothing to do with him anymore. V'lo nachalalanu b'ben Yishai ish lo'halav Yisrael. Every man to his own tent. So this essentially is the marching. The march that people would say when they want to go against the unified government, to say every man to himself. Ish le'ohalav. We'll actually see how this verse picks up at the very end of the story again, but means something very different. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind and remind me if I don't point it out at the end. Ish le'ohalav Yisrael. Everyone to their own tent, meaning we have nothing to do with King David. Let's go back to Sefer Shoftim where it was total anarchy. So Vaya'al, Kol Ish Yisrael, Me'acharei David, Acharei Sheva ben Bichri. So all the other tribes follow Sheva ben Bichri. Right? Essentially, Sheva ben Bichri is assigning himself kingship, essentially. V'ish Yehuda dafku b'malkam. But Judah stayed with King David, min hayarden va'ad Yerushalayim, which is a very small, right, from the Jordan River to Jerusalem. Right? It's that sliver of like the land of Judah, which is essentially just this little tiny sliver. So what happens? Vayavo David al Beito Yerushalayim. So he goes back to Jerusalem, and now we have a very strange kind of interlude right? In the middle of a revolt that is now unfolded in the land of Israel, we have this very odd pasuk. What happens? David goes back to Jerusalem. He has a rebellion. And what happens? Vaikach HaMelech et Eser Nashim. He takes his 10 wives, Pilakshim, meaning his concubines, and he places them Lishmor Habayit. He places them like almost like in a tower, like in an ivory tower. He puts them away. Vaitneim Beit Mishmeret Vayichlakim. He gives them lots of food, but he hides them away. Va'alehem lova. He never went back to them. Vatiyena tzurot ad yom mutan almanut chayut. And these women who were his wives and his concubines remained, in essence, celibate from their husband David until the end of their.
Didn't he leave those 10 pilakshim in the merit of Avshalom when he fled from Avshalom? He left those 10 pilakshim to quote Lishmor Abayit, whatever that really means, in fact.
Yes.
It was difficult then.
Correct. So these 10 pilakshim, for whatever reason, were left behind, and Avshalom had relations with these women, right? That's the understanding. So if a father has relations with a woman, and the son also does, so it becomes aser, meaning the father can no longer live with these women. So he says, I'm responsible for them, but I no longer can live with them because my son has already been with them. So he sets them up for kind of future success. But it is kind of strange that the pasuk kind of lets them kind of in this story. It's a very strange, like, what's it doing here? Perhaps because David has now reached Jerusalem, so it wants to kind of tie the knot to the previous story before moving on. So that's kind of like the last part of a previous story. And now we move full force into the actual rebellion. So who are our characters? Vayomer HaMelech El Amasa. One of them is Amasa. If you recall, Amasa was originally somebody who fought with King David, turned rogue and fought with Avshalom, but then came back to David. So he has a shaky history. Nevertheless, is now back with King David, and David says to him, I want you to lead the charge against Sheva ben Bechri. Hazekli at Ishi Hudash Loshet Yamim. He says, go around the countryside for 3 days and gather up the troops. Ve'ata po amod. And then come back to me. So he gives him a job. What's the pasuk tell us? Vayilach Amasa lazik et Yehuda vayochar min hamoed asher ya'ado. He tarried. He came late. So when you see somebody coming late in Tanakh, there's a few different things that could be happening here, right? Who's the most famous person to come late to something? Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu comes late and Cheda Egel takes place. So people who are not on time, right? Yekis have it right? If you're not on time, everything goes crazy. So he comes late, which already clues us into something, which is that he is doing something wrong. He didn't get lost in the woods. Rather, he is up to no good. He has some other ulterior motive, which is why he's not coming back on time. And we'll see that play out in just a moment. So Vayomer David el Avishai. So David now turns to Avishai, right? If Amasa is not coming back, so he turns to Avishai. Ata yeralanu Sheva ben Bechri min Avshalom. You're going to go get Sheva ben Bechri. He's even worse than Avshalom. I'm even more afraid of him. Ata kachet avdi adonecha urdof acharav. Chase him out of here. Pen matzalo arim betzirot v'hitzil einu. Lest Sheva ben Bechri find a walled city, which he eventually does, by the way, at the end of the story. And that's going to be the end of us. Meaning, if the rebellion has a walled city, we're not going to be able to take over. So Vayetzu acharav and Yoav. So Yoav goes out. He brings his soldiers with him. They go to chase Sheva ben Bechri. And here is a wild story, right? If you don't clue into the fact that Amasa was late, the next verses seem very strange. Haim im ha'even hagdolah asher b'givon. So what happens? Yoav gets to Givon. And what's he see? Amasa balifnehem. Amasa is in Givon. So we have this meeting of Yoav and Amasa, both who are captains, generals in the army of David, and they meet. So in a moment, we're going to find out that Yoav secretly, surreptitiously comes up to Amasa and kills him. Right? Vayov chagur midol levusho. He's wearing his sword, but he has it in the wrong place. So Amasa didn't notice. Vayomer Yoav la Amasa. He says, Hashalom atachi. Good afternoon. He goes to kiss him, right? Think of like Yaakov and Esau, Vayinashag. He goes to kiss him. Amasa didn't notice that there was a sword, Asher biyad Yoav vayakeyu, and he stabs him to death, right? And it gets a little gory, explaining exactly, and he dies. What's happened? Why is Yoav killing Amasa. David commands Amasa to go. So what's going on here? So where is Giv'on? I've bolded Giv'on because that might be one of the clues. Giv'on is a city in Benjamin. So if Amasa is tarrying in the heartland of Benjamin, Benjamin is the tribe of Sheva ben Bichri. So it appears that Tanakh is kind of alluding to us that Amasa is up to no good and is actually no longer on the side of David. He's actually getting troops ready to fight for Sheva ben Bichri. So Yoav realizes this, and this is the second time he's done it. He fought for Avshalom. So Yoav comes up and he knows this, and he kills Amasa on the spot. But if you don't read into the verse a little bit and see the clues, it seems like a very strange story.
It's very strange.
Mhm.
Okay, so they continue on. V'isha maralav minare Yoav. So the Yoav now realizes he's got a problem because Yoav now killed the other military leader. So he kind of makes a standoff and he says, listen, if you want to follow me, come with me. If not, you got to leave now. So many of the people follow Yoav and they continue now to find Sheva ben Bichri. And you'll just notice kind of the literary kind of piece here in verse 12. Amasa's dead, but what does the verse now continue to tell us about his death? Amasa mitkolel badam. He's rolling in his own blood. Betoch hamesila, on the road, on the path. Vayar ha'ish ki amad kol ha'am. Nobody could pass over him, like his body is just in the middle of the road. Vayesev et Amasa. So what do? They have to move Amasa to pass through the road. So I think what's going on here is it's a literary tool to say that even in his death, he is blocking the path to King David's success, right? That he's dead now, and nevertheless, he is stopping people from getting to kill Sheva ben Bichri, just like he did in his lifetime. They push him off to the side, and they go to chase Sheva ben Bichri. So Vayavor b'chol shtei Yisrael Avela. They go all the way up to Avela uBeit Ma'aka. It's a place called Avel Beit Ma'aka. V'chol haberim, with all of its kind of be'er, it's here is reference to like water holes nearby. Vayikalu vayavo af acharav. Okay, so they chase Sheva ben Bichri all the way, look at the map over here, all the way from the area of Benjamin to Avel Beit Ma'aka. So it's actually not on the map here because it's just a small location. Very few maps actually have it, but see Dan's all the way up north. I'm sure many of you have been to Tel Dan. It's just to the west of Tel Dan. It's like right here. So that's where Avel Beit Ma'aka. So he's chased him essentially up the entire Jordan Valley, right? So all the way up north to the very northern border of the land of Israel. So if I was just giving this shir, generally speaking, I would probably now just move on and not tell you a little bit about the place Avel Beit Ma'aka, but I feel obligated to do so because I actually spent 4 weeks one summer digging at Avel Beit Ma'aka. Avel Beit Ma'aka has only been an archaeological site for a couple of years. I was in the second year a couple of years ago. And here's an image of it, right? This is Avel Beit Ma'aka. You can tell it's a mound. This is the northern side, and it kind of slopes down. So I worked over here, getting up every morning at 4:30 a.m., working on the site. And we found a lot of the ruins of what was, Assyrian and Jewish settlements there. So it's a really fascinating place on the northern border. It's 2 kilometers from Lebanon. So it's like really on the border there. We had to end early that summer because Lebanon decided to throw us fireworks that year. But it's an interesting location. So this is where the story took place, all the way on the northern border. Okay. So vayavo vayatziru alav ba'avila, right? He made it to a walled city. So they get to the city of Avel Beit Ma'aka, vayishbechu solula. So they have to build a mound to get into the city because it's walled. So vata'amod bachel v'chol ha'am asher et Yoav mashretim l'hapil ha'chamat. Right? They're battering the wall to knock it down. Which, imagine, this doesn't happen overnight, right? The story of Masada, right? Making these structures takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So it doesn't happen overnight. And this is the famous story of the Isha Chochma, the wise woman. Vatikra Isha Chochma Minayir, wise woman in the city, calls out to Yoav, who's trying to, in essence, destroy the city that now has Sheva ben Bichri behind its walls. Shimu, Shimu, Imruna, says the woman. Again, it's like a very poetic, almost prophetic, hero, listen. El Yoav, Krav, Adhena, Va'adabar Elecha. Yoav, come before me, says the Isha Chochma, so I will speak to you. So it's this very kind of powerful moment. Vaikrav Eleha, so he goes to her, Vatomer Haisha, Ata Yoav, are you Yoav? Vayomer Ani, yes. Vatomer Lo, she says to him, Shma divrei amatecha, listen to your maidservant, me, this Isha Chochma, Vayomer Shomea Anochi, I'm listening. So by the way, parenthetically, there's a whole midrashic literature about this Isha Chochma. Does anybody know who the Medrash tells us this Isha Chochma is? This wise woman? Serach bat Asher. So if anyone recalls, Serach bat Asher is listed in the Torah as one of the, she's listed in two places, and it's the daughter of Asher. And it's like, what is she doing here when it's the only woman in most of these lists that's mentioned. And furthermore, the famous Medrash is that she was the one who told Moshe Rabbeinu where to find the bones of Yosef. And she continues to reappear all throughout Midrashim, throughout Tanakh. And the Medrash is she never really dies, right? She just lives on.
She's like the Lubavitcher Rebbe.
Exactly. So she kind of reappears in all of these stories. And she reappears, according to the Medrash, here as well. And the reason they do that is because she says something that reminds us of something, and I'll just point that out to you why the Medrash thinks that. So what happens? They come up, and she says, Anuchi Shalumei Emunei Yisrael. I, says the wise woman, am the Shalumei Emunei Yisrael. I am the peaceful, faithful one of Israel. So clearly this woman was a very well-known figure in the northern area. And the Medrash assumes that Shlomei Emunei Yisrael, Emunei Yisrael, according to the Medrash, is a reference to the 70 who went down to Mitzrayim. And according to this, Serach bat Asher was actually one of the 70 who went down to Mitzrayim originally, and she was the 70th. You probably are familiar with the Yocheved is the 70th, right? She was born in between the wall. So there's another Medrash that says that it was actually Serach bat Asher, so they assume that maybe this is her. Okay. So she says, you want to destroy the city. This is a massive city on the northern border, and you want to destroy it just for one guy? Why are you destroying the inheritance of God? So Yoav says to her, you know what? I never had any intention to destroy the city, even though it seems like it, right? He's trying to destroy the walls. So what does he say? Right? I'm only trying to get Sheva ben Bichri. So it says, verse 22. So she says, let me give you him. Right? Through her wisdom, she cuts off the head of Sheva ben Bichri, throws his head, she throws it over the wall, the shofar blasts, again, we see that word. Everyone goes back to their tents. Here, it's not to say that everyone's going back to their tents to attack King David. Here, it's the opposite. It's a peaceful ish lo halav. So there's two different ways in which the phrase is used, one that opens the story and one that ends the story, but you can see the clear connection between them. V'Yoav shav Yerushalayim el hamelech. Yoav returns to the king in Jerusalem. So this essentially is the conclusion of one of the famous stories of Sheva ben Bichri. And what makes this story even more famous, at least throughout the post-Tanakh, is that the story of Sheva ben Bichri becomes one of the sources for what a Jew has to do in such certain situations when we're called upon to give up somebody to be put to death. So I wanted to show you that very, very briefly because the story itself becomes very important in subsequent Jewish law. So I just brought you one small source from the Rambam, although you can find this all throughout parts of the Gemara Sanhedrin and certainly all throughout Rishonim and Achronim. So just look at this for just one moment. This is actually in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, right, which is the Rambam's opening part to his Mishnah Torah, and it's all about the essentials of the Torah, one of which is the mitzvah to either die al Kiddush Hashem or to ensure that you do not give over a Jew in certain situations where it would be harmful. And so look what happens here. V'chein, in amru lahem goyim, if non-Jews tell you, tnu lanu echad mekem v'nehargenu, if non-Jews say, give us one Jew in order that we won't kill all of you, so you have 10 Jews, they say, give us one, you guys have to choose. So what's the psak? Im lav naharo kulcham, they're going to kill everyone if we don't choose. Yehargu kulam, says the Rambam. Everyone has to die. Jews are not allowed to choose which Jew dies. V'al yimsiru lahem nefesh achat miYisrael. You're not allowed to give them one Jew. However, notes the Rambam, and this is others as well, im yichaduhu lahem, if they say specifically, give me so-and-so, ve'amru tnu lanu ploni o naharu es kulchem, or we'll kill everyone, im haya mechuyav misa, if that person was liable for death because they had committed a crime, kisheva ben bichri, yitnu oto lahem, you are permitted to hand him over. So we actually learned from the story of Sheva ben Bechri, this particular halacha, which is that you're allowed to hand over another Jew in such a case where that other Jew is supposed to be put to death for something that they've done. There's a lot more that can be discussed here, not for today, but I just wanted to kind of point that out. And that's why it becomes very important. And obviously throughout Jewish history, Inquisition, these things come up. But I just wanted to kind of point that out, which is why this story has a life unto itself in the post-Tanakh. But note how the Rambam says we don't teach people this halacha, right? We don't want to tell people this halacha for various reasons. Okay, well, that's the end of the story of Sheva ben Bechri. Before we move on, that was part one. Got halfway through this year, and we'll move on to part two. Before we do that, I just want to spend like 1 to 2 minutes on the middle chapters. We're not going to be focusing on them this evening. There's way too much to cover there, but I just wanted to briefly tell you what they are, just in case, just to give you a frame. So after the story of Sheva ben Bechri, the following couple of chapters are likely not in chronological order, which is odd. Right? Most of the Sefer is chronological. They stop being chronological, and you'll actually notice this if you read through the stories. It sounds like we're talking about things that are happening like right after King Shaul died, which is odd. So the last couple of chapters, the Rishonim trying to figure out where to place it and why they're separate. But nevertheless, they're almost like stories that were added at the end of Sefer Shmuel Bet. And some of the stories include a story with the Gibeonites. It's a really fascinating story. There's a couple of stories in there about revolts with the Plishtim and wars. And then there's this massive song, right? Chapter 22 is a massive song, which is almost word for word Psalm 18.
I said it was one of the Psalms.
Exactly. Yes, it's almost word for word. There are a couple of word changes and chazals to figure out why there are differences, but there are some changes. And the assumption is that maybe this one was the first and then it was like touched up and put into Psalms. So chapter 22 is songs, is a tehillah. And then chapter 23 opens with a couple last words that David is kind of giving over, even though David has not yet died. David's not going to die till the beginning of Melachim Aleph. Nevertheless, this is the end. And then we have like 30 verses listing all of the household of David, all his generals, his soldiers, everyone. And that's just a long list that we're not going to go through. But what is this doing here? So just very, very briefly, one approach is to say it's almost like a chiastic structure, that at the very end of David's life, we want to almost sum up some of what the king was about. The middle is the song. On both ends, we have two stories about famine, right? The last one is the story we're about to begin, which is the story of famine and plague, which is going to be the story of the census. And then kind of sandwiched between that, before you get to the song, are other two areas of David's life. There's a lot more to deal with there, but I just wanted to kind of give you a brief overview. It seems to be some sort of chiastic structure that gives you a brief overview of David's life and his trajectory in his life. Like the top, the middle is like the peak, and then he kind of goes downhill again. Okay, but now without further ado, we're going to move on to chapter 30. Excuse me, to chapter 23, which is the final chapter. The final story of King David is once again in Shmuel Bet a story of failure, in essence, right? David makes a poor decision, and that leads to calamity for the people of Israel. The story revolves around the sin of counting Jews. So before we do that, I just wanted to bring you the locus classicus of the sin itself. Shmot, chapter 30. We know this. If you want to count Jews, there's a way to do it. You have to give v'nanu ish kofer nafsho l'Hashem bifkorotam v'lo yeh behem negef bifkorotam ze yitnu kol ha'aver el ha'pikudim machatzira shekel. How do you count Jews? With a half shekel.
The shekel.
Exactly. So throughout, we actually see in a few other places in Tanakh, Shaul, for example, has to count people, and what's he do? He counts their animals, or he counts like they have an animal in front of them. He doesn't count the Jew. You count an object that the Jew owns. And why do you do that? In order, lo yeh bahem negef bifkod otam. So in order to not have a plague, a magaifa, erupt. Why is it the case that if we count Jews, a plague is going to erupt? Many different reasons why we could discuss this. We could go on for hours. Many different theories. I'll just throw one. Could be that maybe every Jewish life is valuable, and it lessens the value of a human life. That's one approach, probably the most prominent approach. But there are many, many different approaches. But it's clear that in Sefer Shmuel, the Torah tells us, don't count Jews. Only count something else in lieu of a Jew. By the way, in the modern state of Israel, this is very challenging. And there's many different approaches in modern poskim about how you have a census in the state of Israel today. And some assume, especially on the right, that it's usher to be counted, and it's not only usher to count, but it's usher to be counted, which is why in Haredi communities often they're under, the numbers are less in the census, which is why they get less services in certain areas because they don't involve themselves in the census. It's an interesting discussion for another time. Okay, so David counts the Jews, which is a problem. Doesn't he know, right? Every Jew, you ask every 5-year-old, they know you don't count Jews, right? Why didn't King David know this? So the Ramban Nachmanides in Sefer Shmuel says the reason David thought he could count the Jews is because he thought this was not a mitzvah forever. It was a horas. It was just an obligation for Moshe not to count Jews, but I can count Jews. So he miscalculated. He didn't realize that was the prohibition. But now I want to turn to the story itself. Okay, I've brought for you the last verse of the previous chapter. Right? Verse 1 is here, but verse 39 is here. I brought it for you because this chapter opens, Vayosef es ha'af Hashem lacharos b'Yisrael. God was angry with the Jewish people. It's odd. Why was God angry? Normally, it says, we sinned and God was angry. Look throughout Tanakh, right? God's anger only comes after we sin. But what comes before this story? A list of David's military officers, right? Where's the sin? So it's possible that maybe the sin is the last verse in the previous chapter. Because who's the last person mentioned? Uriah Hachiti, Bathsheba's husband. Right? Mm-hmm. That is to say that David is still in the throes of that initial sin, right? That sin with Bathsheba is still, God is still angry with him because of that sin. And it also compounds the sin because Uriah Hachiti, before, if we just read the story, who's Uriah Hachiti? Some guy. He chose some guy. But he's counted among the 37 military men of David, which means that he was not just a Joe Schmo. He was a real man in the army of David. So it compounds the sin as well. So Vayosef af Hashem lacharot b'Yisrael, Vayases es David bahem lemor. So this caused David to do something. It's almost like God is angry at David, and I don't know, does God push David to do it? It's unclear exactly what's going on here. Like what causes David to now count the Jewish people? Perhaps it's because there was already famine in the land of Israel, connecting it to previous stories. So in the Torah, when do we do census? We count Jews after a battle, after a magefa. So perhaps there had just been a magefa, or it's battle, right? David wants to count how many soldiers we have in the kingdom. So Lech Meneit Yisrael ve'et Yehuda. So what does David say? Go and number the Jews, count the Jews. So what I've done for you here, which I've not done before, is I've inserted a couple of verses from Divrei Hayamim. I noticed in the blue Divrei Hayamim, because Divrei Hayamim recounts this story with a couple interesting commentaries, I guess, or a couple interesting anecdotes that are in Divrei Hayamim that are not found here. How does Divrei Hayamim describe this? Vaya'amod Satan al Yisrael. Satan comes upon Israel. Vayases es David libnoses Israel. So it's almost like there's this force that is causing David to do what he does. So it's almost like a little bit of a Job story here, that David is this character that is now going to be tested once more and is almost being taunted by God to do so. Vayomer Hamelech El Yoav. So the king says to Yoav, I want you to go, shoot na b'chol shiftei Yisrael midan va'ad Beersheva, from the north to the south, go count the people. I want to know how many there are. Yoav understands that this is a mortal mistake. God says to us, we've been promised to be a numerous nation. There's no reason to count us. He says, Lama chafetz badavar hazeh, why do you want to do this? It's interesting because remember Yoav in the story of Bathsheba was complicit, right? He let it happen. He let Uriachi to go out to battle. So here, maybe Yoav is trying to fix what is wrong. He's trying to say, not so fast, David. He's trying to second guess the king. It doesn't work. In the end, the king counts the Jews. But you can see how he is kind of or slightly trying to adjust the king's decision. So Vayichazak Devar Hamelech Yoav. The king says, absolutely not. I want to count the people. So he sends them out to count the people. The next 3 verses just describe him going all throughout the country. He counts the people. Notice how Divrei Hayamim tells us one other just interesting piece that is not in Shmuel Bet. Who's not counted? Levi. Why not? They're never included in the censuses, even in the Torah, right? They get counted separately because Levi doesn't fight in battles, right? Levi is separate.
Right.
Exactly. What about Binyamin? Levi and Binyamin lo pakar b'tocham. Any ideas? What about Benjamin?
Aren't they in the enemy camp now?
So some Benjamites are maybe not there, but the tribe still exists. I mean, there are still
Yeah, but he was the one.
They created the issues with
in the
Sheva
first
ben
place.
Bichri in a way.
Yeah, they weren't
because
loyal in the first place.
So maybe because we assume, they were disloyal to King David. So certainly he's not going to ask them to fight with him. So he just doesn't keep them involved. He doesn't want to count them. So that would be one reading. That's kind of a more harsh reading of King David, which is a valid reading. Another approach is to say that maybe they don't count the tribe of Benjamin, because Benjamin might really just be part of Judah. So they're just not counted separate. Maybe that's what it means. Or the tribe of Benjamin is so small because, remember, Pilegesh Bagiv at the end of Shoftim, and just after Sheva Mebichri, we imagine that many of the tribe of Benjamin have been afflicted, been killed by King David. So their numbers are very small. So what Yoav is actually doing here is actually quite smart. He doesn't do it because he knows he knows that the king's word, it's abominable to him because he knows it's usser. So he doesn't count Levi or Binyamin because he doesn't want the plague to catch on to them as well. He knows that the people of Benjamin are so few at the moment, he doesn't want them involved in the sin. So it's a different perspective. You can take it or leave it, but it's another way to approach what's going on here. Okay, so what happens? They come throughout the land and it takes them 9 months and 20 days. Not bad, right? We're currently in the throes of a census. It takes us a long time, right? 9 months and 20 days, they come back to Yerushalayim. So Vaitain Yoav et Mispar Mikaraam, he brings the numbers. So how many Jews are there? Interesting to note. How many Jews?
500,000.
So 800,000 men of the tribes of Israel and about 500,000 of Judah. So Judah is massive in comparison to the rest of the tribes. Actually, if you look in Divrei Hayamim, the numbers in Israel are much larger. They're over 1 million. So just different numbers, why they're different, we could figure that out. But nevertheless, Judah is massive in comparison. But there are many more Jews living in the land of Israel today in this story than there were in Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? 600,000 men of army age were counted, and now we have over 1 million. So there are more Jews living in the land at this time. So what happens? David counts the Jews, the numbers come in, and the second the numbers come in, Vayach Lev David Oto, Acharein Kain, Safar Ta'am. So after King David counts the people, he's kind of, his heart is broken. He realizes something's wrong. Vayomer David al Hashem. David turns to God. Chatati me'od asher asiti. So David, similar to the story of Bathsheba, he sins, but here, even without the prophet, David actually acknowledges his wrongdoing, right? He says, Chatati me'od asher asiti. He adds even more, the emphasis me'od, perhaps here, because he himself has not only sinned, but he's actually maybe caused each and every Jew to sin by being part of the census. So V'ata Hashem havernat avon avdecha ki niskalti me'od. Right? Please, I beseech you, God, remove my sin because I've sinned gravely. So what happens? David gets up in the morning, Vayakam David baboker, and just like in the story of Bathsheba, we had a prophet, Natan. Here we have the prophet God. Right? God is another prophet during the time of David. And he says the following. Verse 12. He gives him choices, exactly. Haloch v'dibarta el David, ko amar Hashem. This is what God says. Shalosh anochi notel alecha. I'm going to give you 3 choices of punishment. This is exceptionally unique. God very rarely, if ever, gives choices for punishment. Right? God gives punishment. He doesn't ask you what you want. But imagine davening Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and you ask, I know I've sinned, but like, give me that punishment, not that punishment. You don't get to do that. Nevertheless, God gives him the choice. So I'm just going to read the choices, and then I'm going to pose a question. So Vayavo God el David, Vayagid lo. So Vayomer lo, what are the choices? Right, here's the menu. Sheva shanim ra'av be'artzecha. You get 7 years of famine in your land. Choice number 1. 7 years of famine in the land. Choice 2, and I've highlighted them in different colors. 3 months, 3 months, your enemies will chase you. Third option, shloshet yamim dever be'artzecha. 3 days of pestilence in your land. He gives him 3 options. Any thoughts as to why he's given options?
Sounds like the plagues. Sounds like the plagues.
It does sound a lot like the plagues, yes. Right? God has a toolbox that he uses, and he kind of sprinkles them in there.
Well, there's one of them. One of the choices is just about him.
Right.
The other 2 affects the people.
So which one?
The
middle one, right?
The middle one, right?
Exactly. The middle choice, right? It's like the middle choice is just David, it sounds like, right? The enemy will chase you. The other 2 are be'artzecha. So that's already giving us a little bit of a window into what's going on here. This is not merely God saying, okay, there's 3 equal choices here. It doesn't sound like there are 3 equal choices here.
He failed his final test.
This sounds exactly. This is an Isayan. God is testing King David to see what he will choose.
Right.
And so now we have to ask the next question, which is, did David make the right choice or lack thereof? Verse 14, Vayomer David al Gad, and we all know this from Tachanun. Tsar li me'od. It's very painful for me. Niplana biad Hashem. Let me fall into God's hands. Ki rabim rachamav. God is merciful. Uviad adam al epola. In the hands of man, I do not want to fall. First of all, before we can talk what does the sentence mean?
He didn't pick the onslaught against him personally.
He didn't choose, and is that expressed in any particular way, or is he just saying I don't choose anything? Meaning, is he explicitly saying he doesn't want that option?
He said Uviad adam al epola.
Yes.
So he said, don't have them onslaught against me personally.
Exactly. So one way to read this pasuk, there's really 2 main ways to read this pasuk. One way is exactly what Bernie said, which is to say, Uviad adam alapola, don't let man attack me. Don't let my enemies chase me. Let me fall into the hands of God. And choices 1 and 3 are plagues, right? We understand that plagues are something that start from an animal, from a locust, right? It starts from animals, right? You could debate what that means once it starts, but it starts from something else. So he says, I don't want to fall into the hands of Adam. Another way to read this is to say, don't let Adam make a choice. Don't let me, King David, choose, which is a different way to read it. Bernie and Vivian don't like that reading. That's okay.
And so much of his life, like constantly running away. It's like his worst fear to have to do that again.
So that, yeah, maybe he that's true. He has spent most of his time running against rebellions. So that might be the reason why God chose it. Meaning to say, David is constantly fleeing Avshalom, Shaul, his whole life. So in essence, God wants him to choose that one, but he doesn't. Meaning because he's so fearful for himself that he now puts everyone else on the line. So let's keep going. Let's keep going on to the story. So what happens? Vayitin Hashem Dever comes, but from morning until evening, and 70,000 Jews die as a result of King David not choosing for himself to be punished as opposed to the nation. So what happens? By the way, there's a debate as to whether God sends Dever and also famine. It's a little bit of a debate, but it sounds like it's just Dever for now. So Vayishlach Yado HaMalach. So the Malach, again, this is almost like the Malach HaMaves or the Malach HaMagefa, comes to Yerushalayim, the seat of David's capital city, to destroy it. Vayinachem Hashem al hara'ah. This sounds a lot like, the stories by Noah, right? Vayinachem, God has mercy. Vayomer lamalach hamashchit. He says to the malach hamashchit, Ba'am ravata heref yadecha, right? Enough is enough. Umalach Hashem haya im goren ha'aravna hayevusi. So God says to the malach, wait, stop for a second. And where was the malach at that moment? In the threshing floor of Aravna, or it says Orna, because in Divrei Hayamim it's Orna, but here it's Aravna, Hayevusi, the Jebusite. Seemingly random, but we're going to see how this random name in this random threshing field is anything but random. So it stops at this moment, but it's not done, meaning David has to do something to stop the plague from finishing off Yerushalayim, right? It's almost like it's there, but it's not. It hasn't destroyed Jerusalem, so it's waiting, and God wants David to do something. So if you look actually in Divrei Hayamim, here it says, Vayisa David et einav, Vayaret malach Hashem omeid bin haaretz ubin hashamayim. He sees the malach standing between heaven and earth, v'charbo shlufa b'yado, holding a sword. It's a little bit more graphic. Nituya al Yerushalayim, where the sword is hovering over the city of Jerusalem. Vayipol David ha'azkenim mechusim basakim, and they mourn. So it's a little just more graphic in Divrei Hayamim. So once again, David says, Vayomer David al Hashem biroto et hamalach. He says, Chatati anuchi heviti, right? We know this, heviti, pashati, etc. I've sinned. So again, David recognizes that it's not over yet. He has to still, meaning his sin now is almost his sin of not choosing. It's the sin of not choosing the right option. So Vayavo God David bayomahu vayomer lo aleh hakim laHashem mizbeach. So God says, there's a way to fix it. Build a mizbeach in the place of the threshing floor, meaning the place where the malach has now ended. It's almost like you need to appease Hashem to get the malach to leave. So what happens? You can't just build a mizbeach wherever you want, because the problem was the goren, meaning this threshing floor, was owned by this guy named Aravna. So what's David have to do? He has to buy it. And this story is screaming for parallels, which we won't be able to go thoroughly through, but I'll mention some of them to you. So what happens? So Vayashkef Aravna, so Aravna sees the king's coming towards him. Vayishnachu lamelech, he bows down. Or who is this guy Aravna? We'll see in a moment. He is not just a person Aravna, he's the king of Yevusi. He's the king Jebusite. And Yevusi was the people who lived around Yerushalayim, the non-Jews. So he says, I'm here. Why? Liknot mi'imcha tagoren. I'm here to purchase it from you. Livnot mizbeach laHashem, to stop the Magifa. Where else do we have a story between a Jewish leader and a non-Jewish leader, and they want to buy something?
Abraham.
Exactly.
This story is very much similar to the story of Abraham. So what happens? He says, he says, take it. I don't want it. You don't have to pay for it. Take it. So Kol Natan Arvanam, take it all. I don't need any of it. So the king says, no. I got to pay for it. This is like the same story. There are differences, but essentially they're parallel stories. So therefore, I want to buy it from you. And he eventually buys it for 50 shekalim, for 50 shekel. A lot of money. Vayiven sham David mizbeach laHashem. So David builds an altar to God. Vaya'al olotu shlamim. Vaya'ater Hashem la'aretz. So God now is entreated. He looks favorably upon the Jewish people. The plague ends. And so here ends Shmuel Bet. It is a very odd ending to the story. Right? Why does it feels like you're like in the middle of something and the story just ends, right? The Magifa has been lifted, the story ends. The way to make this, to understand what's going on here and why the story seemingly ends in a very strange place is to just look at like 4 verses in Divrei Hayamim. Like 4 verses will clear it all up for us. Because the way that Shmuel Bet ends is actually the perfect ending for Shmuel Bet. And I'll show you what I mean. Look at Divrei Hayamim for a moment. Again, the blue. It just so happens, though, the verses seem to line up. It's kind of odd. It's just random that way, but it just happens to do that. So, Vayiven Sham David Mizbeach LaHashem, we're going back to our story in Divrei Hayamim. What's it say? He builds Vayal Olotu Shlamim, Vaikra LaHashem, Vayaneu Ba'ish Min HaShamayim Al Mizbach HaOlah. What's going on here? He purchases land from this guy who we're told is actually the king of the Yevusim. Magefa stops. He builds an altar there, offers altars to God, offers animals to Hashem. Eish min hashamayim comes down. What does this sound like? Where else do we see Eish min hashamayim come down in a story like this, where you're giving?
Sorry.
Eliyahu?
Eliyahu.
Also in the Mishkan, right? When the Mishkan is built, Vateitze eish milifnei Hashem, a fire comes out. It's miraculous. Where is the threshing floor of Arvana HaYevusi? Where is it?
Har Habayit.
Har Habayit. The threshing floor of Arvana is Har Habayit. How do we know that? That seems to be random. Who is the owner? It's the king of the Jebusites.
How do we know that?
So let me explain. The king of the Yevusim, Yevusi were the people who owned Yerushalayim prior to its conquest by David. So it's going to be on a hill somewhere in the area of the Yevusim. And then in the story, King David builds a Mizbeach on a particular location in the area of the threshing floor. And we know from we know from Divrei Hayamim and the beginning of Malachim Aleph that King David began the process of building the Beit HaMikdash by buying up all of these things for the Mizbeach and for the temple itself. And how does Divrei Hayamim end the story? Again, what's the connection? It's because of this. Umishkan Hashem Hasher Asam Moshe V'Amidbar Mizbeach Olah Va'etahi Babama B'Givon. The story concludes by telling us that the Mishkan is still over there. That is to say, this is going to be the next stage in Jewish history. The Mishkan is over there, but what David has now established is the location for the temple, because up until now, we have no idea where the Beit HaMikdash will be built. Remember, David wanted to build it. Where was he going to build it? Could have been Beit El, could have been Hebron, could have been Yerushalayim. We don't know where it's going to be. Right? We saw a story earlier where it could have been somewhere else. This is the story that establishes that the location of the temple will be Yerushalayim, and Chazal tell us that David HaMelech built the Mizbeach, and this is the story of him building the Mizbeach. And look how Divrei Hayamim ends here. I'll just show you a couple pieces of it. Vayomer David, Zehu Beit Hashem HaElokim. David says, this is the house of God. V'zeh Mizbeach le'olah Yisrael. He then, verses 2 through 4, hires people to start building the temple. He doesn't obviously build it, but he gets people to start. Vayomer David Shlomo B'nei Na'ar, Varach, my son, my young son, this is the bayit that you will build. Lehagdil, Lemala, L'Shem, L'Tiferet, you will build it, and it will be a house for God that all the nations will see. Vayichin David la'rov lifnei moto. So David began preparing the building, the Beis HaMikdash, before his death. So the end of Shmuel Bet ends with David purchasing this land and building the Mizbeach that will be the altar that was going to be used in the temple. So it's actually the perfect place to end Shmuel Bet, because it's really the transition between the story of King David and the story of Shlomo HaMelech, because a couple chapters into Malachim, we'll see King Shlomo build the temple. Before we conclude, we're going to just in a moment, we're going to recite the Hadran, right? This is the end of right here, Vayiven Sham David Mizbeach. This is the end of Shmuel Bet. We'll recite the Hadran. After the Hadran, you're more than welcome to stay on for a few minutes to continue conversations, discussions, questions. But just in terms of time, I just want to make sure we get the Hadran, and then we can continue our conversations. So let me jump in. Oh, and before we do that, I just wanted to mention that we're going to be starting, Malachim Bet is going to be starting, we're starting a new time and new dates. It's going to be Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. So mark your calendar, Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. We're going to be doing Malachim Aleph, Tuesday evenings, 8 p.m. That'll be starting, I guess, a week from this Tuesday. But please join me next Sunday, a week from today at 1 p.m. We have the privilege of Rabbi Alex Israel, who is like the great author of commentaries on Malachim Aleph and Malachim Bet, printed by Maggid Press in their Tanakh series. He's going to be giving us a Shir Paticha, an introductory class, giving us an overview of Shir Aleph and Bet. And that's going to be our introduction. And then that Tuesday, a week from Tuesday, this Tuesday, a week from Tuesday, we're going to begin Malachim Aleph with Rabbi Yoni Rabinovich, who is our rabbinic intern. All right, so without further ado, let's turn to the Hadran. Okay, before let me just pull that up. Just want to wish a mazel tov, and again, we apologize if there may have been omissions. Sometimes people sign up like after we already made the list, and if you want to shoot me an email or Batsheva, we're happy to add your name to the list as well. All right, and I'll turn it over now to the Kelmans, I believe, to read us our first. They're still with us. Let's see. Are they? Don't see them at the moment. All right, so I'll start us off. Hadran alach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Hadran alan Dantach alan Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Tatach alan Lo nitnashem minach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Lo titnashem minan Lo bal ma'adem v'Lo bal be'adate. Hadran alach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Hadrach alan Dantach alan Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Tatach alan Lo titnashem minach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Lo titnashem minan Lo bal ma'adem v'Lo bal be'adate. Hadran alach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Hadrach alan Datan alach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Tatach alan Lo titnashem minach Sefer Shmuel Bet v'Lo titnashem minan Lo bal ma'adem v'Lo bal be'adate. Yeh ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lei avotenu shetehei toratcha u'manatenu ba'olam hazeh u'tehei manu l'olam haba Chanina bar Papa Rami bar Papa Nachman bar Papa Achai bar Papa Abba bar Papa Rachman bar Papa Rachish bar Papa Surcha bar Papa Ada bar Papa Dar bar Papa.
Yeah, great.
Avi, you want to Schreiber?
Surely. Arevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratecha b'finu u'b'piyot amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu kulanu v'tze'etzainu v'tze'etzai amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shmecha v'lomdei Toratcha me'orvai techakmeni mitzvotecha ki li'olam hi li yehili bitamim b'chukecha l'man lo evosh li'olam lo eshkach pikudecha kivam chi yitanu baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukecha.
Amen.
Modim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lei avotenu shesamta chalkenu miyoshvei beit hamedrash telo samta chalkenu miyoshvei kranot she'anu mashkimim v'hei mashkimim anu mashkimim l'diver Torah v'hei mashkimim l'diver b'telim anu amelim v'hei amelim anu amelim u'mekablim sachar v'hei amelim v'einu mekablim sachar anu ratzim v'hei ratzim anu ratzim l'chaye holam haba V'heim ratzim lever shachat. Shne'emar v'ata Elokim toredim lever shachat. Anshe damim umrima. Lo yechatzu yemehem v'ani eftach bach. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Elohai. Kashem shezratani l'sayim Sefer Shmuel Bet. Kain ta'azrini l'hatchil ma'aseichtod u'v'svarim achirim u'l'saymam. Lilmod u'lalamed. Lishmor v'lasod u'l'kaim et kol divrei Talmud Toratacha bi'ava. U'schut kol Tanaim ve'amoraim u'talmidei chachamim ya'amod li u'lezari v'lo tamush haTorah mipi u'mipi zari ad olam. Vayitkayem bi behitalechecha tan che'otach b'shoch b'chatish marlecha v'hakitach bi tesichecha kivi yirbu yamecha v'yosifu lecha shnot chayim orech yamim bimina bismala osher v'chavod Adonai oz le'mo yitain Adonai yivarech Amo v'shalom. Mazel tov to everyone. Here's our flyer. Please join us on next Sunday with Rabbi Alex Israel, followed on Tuesday with Rabbi Yoni Rabinovich, and then obviously with Ora Weinbach and myself as well.
Excellent.
Thank you all for coming. I'm happy to stay on for a few extra minutes to take any questions, field any questions, and I'll take a look at the chat.
Thank
Oh,
you.
yeah, I was there.
Thank
My
you.
phone
Thank you.
apparently didn't unmute.
It's all right.
I just said the whole thing. I had it written right out there. Sorry about that.
Halifa, no problem.
Okay. I'm
Yes,
sitting
Carl.
out here in beautiful backyard of my brother-in-law in Westchester, watching you on my phone and listening to your class. And then I was ready to go, and I did it. All right. So quite.
Thank you.
All right. I don't get, it's fine.
Yeah,
Very good. You should go. Fine class. Nice, Henry. How are you, Henry?
Hello, Ira.
Hello.
You look great.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm feeling pretty good. Too.
Ellie,
Yes.
there's Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik has given a number of lectures on David HaMelech, in which he basically takes on, I can't remember the name of the other protagonist, but the other protagonist essentially says that David HaMelech was the first Machiavellian king and was extraordinarily cruel and heartless and manipulative. And Meir Soloveitchik says no, because David HaMelech was always close to God and was always had in mind what God wished for him. And whenever he sinned, he returned to God. And he says, therefore, the allegation that he was a Machiavellian king doesn't hold. But it does seem to me that the other guy has the better part of the argument, and that David was basically sort of always out for himself.
Yeah, so I would say, the character, King David, had some serious flaws along the way. So in that sense, I think you could equate the Machiavellian route in some sort of way to King David. But I would add the major difference is that even when he went off the derech in all of these cases, he always recognized it almost immediately and did turn to God, which is something you wouldn't find in other leaders. Right? We know that that's his downfall, meaning Bathsheba and those types of stories is what causes King David to, in essence, lose his kingship to go to his son. But he does continuously sin, but nevertheless always recognizes that his sin kind of put him at odds with God, and he turns toward God in Shuva, and that essentially is why he becomes a model to look at to, because he actually recognizes where his sin, where his faults are. Yeah, good point.
Rabbi, in a couple chapters earlier, there's to talk about there was a 3-year famine, and it explained because Shaul killed and wrote in. And here there's a Magefah, and explained on David, because David sinned. So here we have examples where it's famine or that the whole, all of Israel is being punished because not for what they did, but for what the king did. Now, in other Nevi'im, it's where the people of Israel are punished because they left God, they go to idols. The nation is being punished not for what they did, but for what the king did. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it would appear that, yes, there is the previous story with the Gibeonites, and there's famine because there seems to be some sort of sin. But I guess to the point of, David as the leader of Israel, in some sense, perhaps is reflective of his own society, you could argue. So the sin of David as the leader, on the one hand, he's responsible for his people. So if he makes a wrong decision, that it literally costs lives. And God and David are in that kind of relationship where if David makes the wrong choice, it will cost lives. You could obviously argue that, well, that's not fair, meaning like the 70,000 people who died, right? It wasn't up to them, but I think that's what leadership's about. And I think maybe that's part of what God's trying to show us here. And I think you see a little bit with the story of Yvonne as well. There's a famine because of a sin that Shaul did. And I think all throughout Tanakh, we have stories where leaders fail and people have to, regular Joes are punished for their sin. So it's almost like the sin of the generation. It's somehow maybe they're tied into it as well, but it's a good point nevertheless. But yeah, that's one of them.
I just wanted to add the fact that he sinned with his senses, and yet God ended up directing him to the place where the Beis Hamikdash is built tells you that God stayed close to him no matter what.
Yes, I think that's true.
He turned it into something positive.
Yeah, I think that's true. Somebody in the chat also asked, did David know that the Beis Hamikdash would be built there? Or did he know it and then this just verified it, or did he have no idea? I think he had no idea. Meaning we know there's going to be a temple. David wants to build the temple, but we don't know where it's going to be, right? There was an earlier story where it sounded like there was allusions to Bein Ktafayim, between the shoulders of Benjamin. Beit El seems to be a perfect location, right? Think about the Tanakh. It's the ultimate question is, why is Yerushalayim chosen over a place like Beit El? Beit El is where the angels are Olim and Yordim. Why Yerushalayim? So I think David did not necessarily know that either. It's the seat of David's power, but who says the Beit HaMikdash has to be there? So I think he did not know, and I think this story is what solidified it, because this is the end of David's life, and perhaps this is like David's final, like the resurrection of his failures, and this, that he can now say, like, this is the way to save my character. It's at this final moment in my life, stop a magefa, save the Jewish people, build a mizbeach, and that becomes the mizbeach that we use in the first Beit HaMikdash.
I have one small question. It says in that last pasuk that he collected all the iron for the Beis Hamikdash. I thought the Beis Hamikdash wasn't supposed to be built with iron.
So the mizbeach, in the Torah, in the Mishkan, can't be of hewn stone. It actually can be in the temple itself. But you can use certain materials for the outer areas, right? You can't use certain things, wood, for example. The Rambam points out, and the Gemara points out, you can't have trees in the temple because of Asherah, right? You can't have trees. Nevertheless, you could have wood on impermanent structures, etc. So you can't use it on certain areas, but you can, like, on the outer parts.
Oh, okay. I know Nechoshes and
bronze.
but I thought iron was forbidden.
Just for the certain kalim, but not for like the outer parts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Great.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yes.
Can you repost the first page of the Hadron?
Yes.
Is that doable?
Yes. Give me one. Yeah, I can do that right now.
Thank you very much.
Who's asking, Ira?
No, it's Howard Blank.
Oh, good. Good.
Sorry, Avi.
Just checking. Just checking.
1 second. Just go back and do that here. All right, you see it?
Approaching a railroad crossing.
Got
Here.
it. Thank you.
Yeah, no
Thank
problem.
you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Really, really enjoyable. Thanks for leading us through this.
Of course, and I look forward to seeing you all on Sunday, and then next week as well, as we delve into the end of the United Kingdom.
Ellie, superb job.
Thank you.
Really great. Really great.
Thank you.
Wonderful to learn with you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Are you done with the share screen? You're good?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. All right, have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Rabbi.